Lawrence Lessig is here. He's the director of the Edmund J. Safra Foundation Center for Ethics at Harvard. A few years ago, he shifted his focus to fighting corruption and reforming our democracy. His new book is called Republic Lost: How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It. I am pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you.
I got lots to talk to you about. So let me just begin with the thing about with the announcement today about the Supreme Court that they're going to hear the challenge, constitutional challenge to the health care reform passed by the Congress.
Yeah, so I think that this court is actually going to uphold this law. I don't actually see how the conservatives, consistent with what they've said before, can vote to strike down this law, especially Justice Scalia, who I think made very clear, in my judgment, the right view of how the Constitution should be interpreted with respect to Congress's power. His opinion in a case about the power of Congress to regulate homegrown marijuana seems to me to directly overlap with the question here, and I think that will lead to this case being upheld.
In other words, if he believes what he believed when he wrote that opinion, he has to come to the conclusion that Congress has the power to do this.
Unless there's some very elegant trick to show why these two issues are different, I think he has to come to the same conclusion here.
What happened to you? I mean, how did you go from here to there? I don't mean in a geographical way.
No, I understand. Well, you know, I mean, I've been on your show many times talking about these issues of intellectual property and the way to think about how to balance this. And what I found was, in the world, people were getting the issue. Parents and teachers, educators, businesses, they were getting the issue. There was no progress among policymakers. And it hit me, you know, one of those moments when you realize you're not as smart as you thought you were, because it's so obvious, that we weren't going to make any progress on this issue until we made progress on a more fundamental issue, which is the fundamental issue about the way money influences the political process. And it wasn't just about esoteric issues like copyright. It was about some of the most fundamental issues like global warming or healthcare or, on the right, simplified tax systems or the size of government. These were all issues where if you get to the root here is the way money blocks the ability to make reform. And so I figured, you know, I had 10 years on that project. I thought every 10 years an academic should throw away all his intellectual capital and move on. So that's what I decided to do here.
And why do you think there hasn't been more change in Washington beyond the issue of the play of money?
Well, I don't...
I'm thinking about the president himself, who was elected on a mandate of change. Yes,
Absolutely.
you can.
Absolutely. I think that what happens is that people get inside the Beltway, and there's a conventional wisdom about the way things have to be. And you have to have an enormously strong character to say, I don't care about conventional wisdom. We're going to do things differently. We're going to actually change the way the system works. And, you know, I, like many people, believe that this president was going to do precisely that. And I supported him. I, you know, was a colleague of his at Chicago. I campaigned for him in this election and every one before. But I think that he has actually betrayed that claim that he had in this election to making this about reform.
And if you said that to him, what do you think he would say?
He would say, we had no choice. We had no choice. And I understand how people think that you have no choice, but I think that taking on a principled stand and setting up a fight, not against the Republicans, but against this corrupt system in Congress, would have actually given him a chance to rally the nation behind him for this cause. But instead, he picked a fight that was a fight against half of the American public, and so therefore he's very easily vulnerable as he defends this existing system.
Meaning what, in terms of he picked a fight with half of the American public?
Well, when he sets this up as if the problem is the Republicans, as opposed to the problem is the system, then Republicans say, okay,
well, he's against me.
He's against me. Right.
That's right.
Right. So, but
it's him versus us.
Right. When he said again and again, if we don't take up the fight to change the way Washington works, he was saying we Americans have to take up the fight to make that system inside the Beltway in D.C. different. And he gave up that fight.
Yeah, but he's also surprised people in terms of in national security issues that he's no different than President Bush, correct?
That's right. And, you know, I think people overestimated the extent to which he was a liberal. I never thought he was a liberal. He said things that I think signaled he'd be different from Bush, and I think that maybe the reality of that, you know, industry is such that he can't make much shift. But the place that he clearly signaled his difference was he wasn't going to be a conventional president, and he's run a completely conventional administration.
You think he'll be reelected?
Well, there's only one Republican I would have any support for over Barack Obama, and so I don't think he's going to be the nominee.
The Huntsman or whom?
No, Buddy Roemer.
Buddy Roman from, oh, yeah.
I mean, Buddy, who's made his whole campaign about the problem of money in politics, and he's taking no more than $100 and taking no PAC money. That's exactly the focus I think we need. That's what the book is about. But I certainly hope that if any of the other candidates are candidates, that Barack Obama
all the Republicans
should be
you've seen, you hope Barack Obama is reelected. Okay. Have we somehow lost our sense of who we are?
Yeah. I mean, it's not hard to have that question when you recognize that we have become completely incapable as a nation of addressing the most fundamental policy problems that the nation faces. So whether it's global warming or healthcare or issues on the right, we have a government that just cannot address and resolve these issues. And I think a lot of people begin to wonder whether democracy itself should be questioned. I was at an event where one of the wealthiest people in the world basically spoke so glowingly about the Chinese system, where we don't have these problems, and instead it's more of a technocratic system. And it terrified me. It reminded me of a story in England in the 1930s of people looking to Germany and talking about how wonderful Hitler was in Germany. And I think there's this general sense that maybe democracy doesn't work anymore. And I think that's a confusion.
I think you're right.
Because
there is a sense that state capitalism maybe is a better way to go.
Yeah, exactly right.
Because they can get things done.
Exactly right.
We want things to be done.
Yeah.
And we think democracy stands in the way.
And I think that might be right. I don't believe that. That might be right. But before we get there, we've got to try to have a real democracy where what's driving the decisions is not the will of a tiny fraction of funders in a campaign, but instead driving the decisions is what we the people actually want. And the system we've got right now systematically distorts what the people want because of the enormous power that the funders have in the system.
Should the president have taken it all on when he got to Washington, head on, almost in a populist full charge?
I certainly wish he had. And then let's have the fight in 2010 about whether this populist charge against the corruption of this system should win. And then let's have the election in 2010 about whether he should win. And I think if he had that election...
Okay, but there was lots of compelling reasons for him to focus on a whole range of things. He thought health care because he already promised that. Some say he could have waited until a later time. Others said he should have focused with a laser-like intensity on the economy and creating jobs. And then you say he should have been about changing the system because that was crucial to getting anything else done over the long term.
Well, look, he took on health care, but he didn't take on health care in the way that he promised, right? He promised during the campaign to have a public option inside of health care. And number two, promised that he would take on a system which he attacked that George Bush gave us, where the pharmaceutical companies didn't even have to negotiate prices for the drugs that they would be selling the government inside of any one of these programs. Those were two fundamental compromises to what he promised in the election. And those compromises lead people to believe it's the same old problem all over again. The same thing with the financial reform. Of course, we had a catastrophe. It had to deal with this catastrophe. But the question is, how do you deal with the catastrophe? Do you do it in a way that signals to the American public that nothing has changed by making a million deals with petty interests in a way that makes it seem like politics is just about bargaining away interest? Or you do it in a way that actually signals that the more fundamental reform, the only way we're going to change this system for our kids, is the fundamental problem. So, we were in a crisis, but a crisis is an opportunity. It was the chance to do something.
Okay, so what's the opportunity today that you're suggesting ought to happen?
Well, I'm not sure the president is at the center of that right now. I wish he would take it up, but I'm not sure that's where it's going to happen. I think actually what people are increasingly recognizing as we look at these populist outside the Beltway movements on the left and the right, on the Tea Party and the Occupy movements, people are recognizing that in a sense we need to build an outside the Beltway movement demanding fundamental change.
So what do you make of this argument? The Tea Party understood that they were agents of change and they got involved in the political system. And that therefore, if Occupy, wherever, Wall Street, wants to have a political impact, it's not by sitting in protest in different venues around the world. It's about getting out right now and saying, we are going to change the composition of the Congress.
Right. But the question is, what's the change you're aiming for? I think that the Tea Party actually moved too quickly to becoming just an arm, to becoming just an arm of the Republican Party. They have enormous power because they have 60 votes, but they're just kind of a Republican engine right now. And they lost, at least some of them, I think, lost the opportunity to say, we're talking about something more fundamental. We're not talking about getting more Republicans in Congress. We're talking about getting a government that's responsive, again, to what the people want. And while I agree with you, I think the Occupy movement has got to recognize that just sitting in Wall Street or sitting on K Street or sitting next to South Station in Boston is not going to change the world. I think that many of them think, look, we're not just talking about getting more Democrats in Congress, because if the Democrats we get in Congress do what they did with the financial reform bill, which is basically sell out to the interests that are there demanding that they give them whatever they want if they want their campaign money, we haven't gotten anything, right? So I think that what I think everybody in a sense recognizes is we've got to find a way to leverage this reform movement to a real change, not just one party taking over another party.
Do you think bankers are smiling saying we won the financial reform fight?
I think that they got a lot more than any of them would have expected they were going to get in 2008. Yeah. Absolutely.
Because, as you know, they're all complaining about the fact that all these regulations will inhibit economic growth.
Yeah, of course they are. But this is exactly what they need to be saying. I think in 2008, if you had asked any of them whether they would be able to block financial reform as effectively as they did, 90% would have said no. They all thought the world was different, that we were going to actually have a substantial re-regulation, but they were so powerful.
But the Volcker Rule will or will not be enacted, well, as it's defined by the regulatory authorities now.
Yeah, but the question isn't what it says at the surface. The question is what the 10,000 regulations underneath it actually do.
That. That's what they're doing now.
Yeah.
Well, take Consumer Protection Agency.
Same thing. Yeah.
In other words, it will be so ameliorated that it'll have none of the teeth that people who created the law
intended it to have. Absolutely. And this is the way our system works. On the surface, you have decisions that make it sound like you're responding.
So that's true in healthcare, it's true in regulation, in financial regulation.
It's the general form of how our government works now. And so then lobbyists
why isn't that... Okay, stay with me, though. I mean, because this is at the heart of your book. Well, that's not a democracy, in your judgment, because a few are making the decisions because of the power of their money and influence.
Right. So our framers gave us what they called a republic. And what they meant by a republic was a representative democracy. And what Federalist 52 says is that a representative democracy would be a government, quote, dependent upon the people alone. Now, whatever that means, what we know is Congress has evolved a different dependency, a dependency upon the funders. And that dependency is different and conflicting with a dependency upon the people, because the funders are a tiny slice of the people. If you ask who in 2010, what percentage of Americans maxed out in a contribution in a congressional campaign, the answer is 0.05%. So, you know, Occupy Wall Street says we're the 99%. That's bad marketing. They should be saying we're the 99.95% who don't have access and influence inside the system, because we are not the 0.05% with the extraordinary power that funders in the system have. So that is a...
And it's even changed more now because of all the court ruling that allowed
independent expenditures. Absolutely. It'll be much worse. So what we've got is a democracy that is corrupted relative to what the framers intended. It's a kind of dependency corruption. And not because the congressmen are criminals. I think this is the confusion when people talk about corruption. I'm not saying that, you know, it's Rod Blagojevich throughout the whole system. I'm not saying that these are people who violate criminal laws. These are good people, decent people who go to Washington trying to do what they want, what they believe is right. But they get in a system where they can't help but be distorted as they spend 30 to 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress.
And if they raise money, therefore they're not being effective at what they believe they were sent there to do.
Absolutely.
Whatever their political opinion.
Right, right.
You know, if you got to worry about getting reelected,
or get your party back in power, you can't help but be distorted. You become shapeshifters as you constantly adjust your view in light of what you do.
So how do you change the financing?
Well, you know, there are two questions. What's the right answer? And the second one is, how do we get there?
Right.
The first one's easy. You know, so I think
What's the right answer, then?
So the right answer is a way of funding elections that's a small dollar system for funding elections. I describe a version of my book which is a little bit different from the ones that have been proposed. It basically says, look, all voters pay at least $50 in taxes. So let's take the first $50 you pay and rebate it to you in the form of a democracy voucher. And then you can use that voucher to give to any congressional candidate, as long as that candidate agrees to fund his or her campaign with those vouchers only and contributions of up to $100 from any citizen. Okay, so $50 a voter is $6 billion in the election cycle. That's 2.5 times the amount spent in 2010. So it's real money. And if it were a system where the majority or 70% of candidates opted into that way of funding their elections, then nobody could believe when Congress did something stupid that it was because of the money. It may have been because there are too many Democrats or too many Republicans, whatever, but it wouldn't have been the money because we had removed this fundamental source of cynicism in our system because congressmen would be raising their money in chunks that nobody could believe would be biased.
And what chance does this have?
Under this Congress, exactly zero. I looked it up on Google. I checked it. It's zero.
It's zero.
Yeah. So what we need is a movement outside of Congress to force the institution into adopting the kind of funding system that we can trust again. Because, they got elected under the old system. They don't want to change it. Many of them see their life under the old system as a stepping stone to becoming lobbyists. There's a kind of farm league for K Street, as Jim Cooper from Tennessee describes it. And so they don't want to change a system where lobbyists won't be as valuable. Right.
Attractive life.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Whatever was that happened to McCain-Feingold?
So it's effectively dead. There's some parts that still survive, but its strategy was different. Its strategy was to say, oh, there's certain kinds of money we don't like. Let's try to dampen it down. And that's been the strategy of reform for the past 30 years. And my view is that's just never going to be enough. You're never going to succeed by trying to silence certain kind of speech in the system. They always find a way to get their influence back in. Instead, we have to find a solution to add more speech into the system, more money into the system, but money that isn't distorted in the way that we think big money is.
So you're a democracy voucher.
Democracy voucher is one way. That's right.
So what else are you working on when you try to deal with the idea of the way the American political system works?
Well, I think the hardest part of this problem right now, so the first one was what's the right answer?
Right.
The second one is how do we get there? The hardest part is recognizing that people from radically different perspectives need to work together to get there. Right? So I went to K Street and I gave a teaching at K Street, and what I said was, you guys may believe in capitalism or not. I mean, I believe in capitalism, but you may or may not believe in capitalism. But nobody believes in crony capitalism. And if you would start inviting Tea Party people down to these meetings and start talking about crony capitalism, you could begin to build a movement that was across-the-board movement for reform. And this could have been scripted in Hollywood. Just then, a guy raised his hand and he said, I was one of the founders of the Tea Party, and I run a website called againstcronycapitalism.com. And I can guarantee you, if you were to start talking like this, you'd have all these Tea Party people down here supporting this movement. Well, after I said that, I started getting killed in the left-wing press by people who are saying this is absolutely the wrong idea to try to begin to talk to those, quote, racists from the right. And my view was, well, wait, I'm not a mathematician, but if you say you're speaking for the 99% and we take 100% and you remove the 30% of Americans who call themselves supporters of the Tea Party, I'm not sure how you get to 99%. But the point is, we have these business models in American life, media as well as politics, that are focused on polarization. Like, let's teach each other to hate each other. And the idea of teaching each other to talk to each other, not by giving up your views, not by compromising, but just saying we need to be able to talk to each other, is the hardest thing to begin to motivate people around. But that's the essential step to getting any kind of change at the level of Constitution.
Okay, suppose I said to you, okay, let's make this table that we're sitting at, a venue for debate on the important questions that ought to be looked at in the coming presidential campaign, congressional campaign as well.
I thought that's what it was.
And it is indeed that. But tell me what the issues ought to be. That's what I'm asking.
Well, at least we've also got to have another debate where we can have a political system where people actually trust the results are the product of principles as opposed to money. 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress. And when 75% believe money buys results in Congress, they naturally, if you're not the person with the money, stay home. They don't participate. They have enormous cynicism. It's an institution which New York Times 2 weeks ago reported has 9% confidence in America, right? 9%. There are more people who believed in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than who believe in this Congress today. So I think we've got to recognize this institution is fundamentally bankrupt, politically bankrupt. And until we can begin to earn the respect, restore some of the trust in the institution, we won't have a system that can call itself the government of the people.
Republic lost. How many corrupts Congress and a plan to stop it? Lawrence Lessig, thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Great to see you as always.
Great to see you.